I've never been good at long drives. The way the road stretches endlessly, the hum of the engine dulling my senses, it always makes me feel like I'm about to drift off. That's what happened this time, too. I was on my way back from a work trip, too stubborn to stop at a proper hotel and too tired to care. When I saw the sign for a motel, I decided it was better than falling asleep behind the wheel. The place looked run down, but at that hour, I didn't care. The neon sign flickered weakly, casting a dull light over the empty parking lot. I could tell this was the kind of place where the sheets might not be clean and the walls would be thin, but it was cheap, and I just needed a bed for a few hours. The receptionist barely looked up when I entered. He was an older man, his eyes dull, as if he hadn't slept well in years. I told him I needed a room, and without a word he handed me the key. "Room 101, he muttered. I noticed how tired he looked, but I was too exhausted to think much of it. The hallway leading to room 101 was dimly lit, the carpet worn and stained. It smelled musty, like it hadn't been aired out in a long time. My room was at the far end, and as I approached, I felt a strange sense of unease. I brushed it off, telling myself I was just tired. Inside, the room was as depressing as I expected. A small bed with a sagging mattress, an old TV, and a chair that looked like it might collapse if I sat on it. But it was quiet, and that's all I wanted. I locked the door, kicked off my shoes, and collapsed onto the bed, hoping to sleep off the uneasy feeling that had settled in my stomach. It didn't take long for the noises to start. At first, I thought it was just the old building settling, the creaks and groans of wood expanding and contracting. But then I heard footsteps in the hallway, soft and slow, like someone was pacing back and forth. I tensed up, my heart pounding, but told myself it was just another guest. The footsteps stopped, but then there were whispers. I couldn't make out the words, but the sound of them sent chills down my spine. I lay there, frozen, straining to hear more, but the whispers were gone as quickly as they'd started. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, that I was hearing things because I was so tired, but the unease wouldn't go away. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear something else. Footsteps, whispers, a door creaking. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that I was just on edge because the motel was so creepy. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Around 3 a.m., I couldn't take it anymore. The noises were getting louder, more insistent, like they were coming from right outside my door. I had to know if someone was there. I got out of bed, my legs shaky, and slowly opened the door. The hallway was empty. It was darker than before, the light at the end of the hall flickering weakly. I stood there, listening, but all I could hear was my own breathing. I was about to go back inside when I noticed something strange. The door to my room didn't look right. It was like the wood was warped or the paint was peeling, but in a way that made the door seem off somehow. I stepped back into the room and shut the door, but the uneasy feeling only grew. The room was colder than before, and the walls seemed closer, like the space was shrinking. I wanted to leave, to get out of that motel, but the thought of driving in the dark while so tired scared me even more. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like something was moving in the room, like there was someone, or something, watching me. I kept telling myself I was being ridiculous, that it was just my tired mind playing tricks, but I couldn't shake the feeling. As soon as the sun came up, I packed my things and left. I didn't even bother to shower or change clothes. I just wanted to get out of there. When I got to the reception desk to check out, the old man was still there, looking just as tired as before. I handed him the key and told him about the strange noises, trying to laugh it off, but he didn't respond. He just stared at me with those dull eyes like he was trying to figure something out. "Room 101, I said. waiting for him to say something. But he just looked at me, confused. "We don't have a room 101, he said, his voice flat. I felt a chill run down my spine. "But that's where I stayed last night. You gave me the key." He shook his head slowly and reached for a map of the motel. He spread it out on the counter, pointing to the rooms. There was a room 100 and a room 102, but no room 101. I felt my mouth go dry as I stared at the map, trying to understand. "There's no mistake," he said, his voice firm. "We've never had a room 101. I didn't know what to say. I could feel panic rising in my chest, and all I wanted to do was get out of there. I mumbled something, grabbed my bag, and hurried to my car. As I drove away, I couldn't stop thinking about the night before. How could I have stayed in a room that didn't exist? Just as I was about to turn onto the main road, I glanced back at the motel. My heart nearly stopped. There, in the window of what should have been room 101, I saw a shadowy figure standing motionless, watching me leave. I floored the gas pedal and didn't look back again. Even now, I can't explain what happened that night, but I know one thing for sure: I'll never stay in another motel as long as I live. I've never been one to believe in ghosts or anything like that. So when I checked into that old motel on the side of the highway, I wasn't expecting anything strange. I was just tired, needed a place to rest for the night. It was one of those run-down places where the neon sign flickers and the paint is peeling off the walls. But it was cheap, and I wasn't picky. The woman at the front desk barely looked at me when I asked for a room. She handed me a key without saying much, pointing me towards the second floor. The place was nearly empty, which wasn't surprising. Who would want to stay in a place like this if they had other options? My room was small, with old furniture and a bed that creaked when I sat on it. The wallpaper was peeling, and there was a musty smell in the air. But it was quiet. That's what I needed most, some quiet and rest. I dropped my bag on the floor, locked the door, and lay down on the bed, hoping to sleep off the exhaustion of the long drive. I don't know what time it was when I first heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from the wall. I opened my eyes and listened. Maybe it was just the wind, I thought, or the old pipes in the building. But then I heard it again, and this time it was followed by a soft, muffled cry. It was so faint that I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. But the sound didn't go away. Instead, it grew more persistent, like something or someone was trying to get out. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. My first thought was that there might be an animal trapped in the walls, maybe a rat or a raccoon. But the more I listened, the more it sounded like a person crying and scratching, trying to get free. I tried to shake off the fear creeping up on me. It had to be something else, something explainable. But the longer I sat there in the dark, the more I couldn't ignore it. The cries were getting louder, more desperate. I needed to know what was making that noise. I got up and started looking around the room, trying to find the source. The sound seemed to be coming from behind an old painting hanging on the wall. The painting was of a landscape, faded and covered in dust. I took it down, revealing a small door behind it, almost like a hidden compartment. My hands were shaking as I opened it, half expecting something to jump out at me. But there was nothing there, just a dusty old journal. The journal was worn and fragile, its pages yellowed with age. I sat down on the bed and started to read. The first few entries were normal, just notes about the weather and the occupant's travels. But as I read on, the entries became more disturbing. The person who wrote the journal, a man named John, had stayed in this very room. He wrote about hearing noises in the walls, just like I did. At first, he thought it was nothing, but then he started hearing the cries, the scratching. He became convinced that someone was trapped inside the walls. someone who needed help. He wrote about how he tried to tell the motel staff, but they didn't believe him. They said he was imagining things, that the room was old and the noises were just part of that. But John didn't stop there. He wrote about how the cries kept him up at night, how they got louder, more desperate. He started to lose sleep, his thoughts becoming more paranoid with each passing day. His handwriting grew more frantic, his words harder to read. He was convinced that the person trapped inside the walls was trying to communicate with him, to tell him something important. But he couldn't figure out what it was. The last entry was unfinished. It ended with a sentence that trailed off mid-word, like John had been interrupted. I felt a chill run down my spine. The journal didn't say what happened to him, but I knew. John never checked out of this motel. By this point, the cries and scratching had gotten so loud that I couldn't ignore them. I needed to find out what was behind that wall. I grabbed a chair and used it to pry at the weak spot where the sound was strongest. The drywall crumbled easily, revealing a small hidden space behind it. And that's when I saw it. A body, curled up in the small space, surrounded by the same peeling wallpaper that covered the rest of the room. The body was decomposed, almost unrecognizable, but there was no mistaking what it was. The smell hit me all at once, a sickening mix of rot and decay that made me gag. The corpse was clutching something in its hand. Another journal, almost identical to the one I had found. I stumbled back, barely able to breathe. The cries and scratching had stopped, replaced by a heavy silence that pressed down on me like a weight. I couldn't stay there another second. I grabbed my bag and ran out of the room, down the stairs, and out into the night. The woman at the front desk didn't even look up as I passed by, as if she already knew what I had found. I drove away from that motel as fast as I could, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. But even now, as I write this, I can still hear the faint sound of scratching in the back of my mind. I don't know who that person was or why they ended up inside the walls, but I know I'll never forget them, and I'll never stay in a place like that again. I didn't expect much from the motel. It was late, and I was tired after driving all day. The sign flickered in the dark, vacancy, glowing in dull red letters. The place was off the main highway, quiet and isolated, which is exactly what I needed. A break from everything. Just one night, then I'd be back on the road. The manager, a middle-aged man with a receding hairline and a too-wide smile, greeted me at the front desk. He was overly friendly, asking too many questions about my trip. Where was I coming from? Where was I going? I answered politely, though his interest felt uncomfortable. Small-town hospitality, I told myself, nothing more. I took the key he handed me and went to my room. The room was basic, old-fashioned, the kind you'd expect in a place like this. Cheap furniture, thin carpet, and a bed that looked clean enough. I locked the door, double-checking it out of habit. As I unpacked, I started noticing little things that didn't feel right. The mirror on the wall seemed slightly off, angled strangely. The clock on the nightstand was facing the bed, but not quite the way it should. I shook off the unease. It was probably just the tiredness playing tricks on me. I tried to relax, turned on the TV, but the feeling didn't go away. I kept glancing at the mirror, at the clock, feeling like something was wrong. I told myself I was being silly, that it was just because I was in an unfamiliar place. But the unease stayed with me, growing stronger. After a while, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I got up to adjust the clock, hoping that would make me feel better. That's when I noticed it. The clock was too heavy, heavier than it should be. My heart started pounding as I unscrewed the back. Hidden inside was a small camera, the lens pointing directly at the bed. I felt sick. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The manager had been watching me. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. Should I confront him? Call the police? The panic was overwhelming. I couldn't stay in that room, but I didn't want to alert him before I had some proof. I decided to check the office first, maybe find evidence, or a way to call for help. I crept out of my room, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The hallway was empty, the whole place eerily silent. The office door was slightly ajar, a dim light seeping through the crack. I pushed it open, praying he wasn't there. The room was cluttered with papers and old equipment. On the desk, a computer screen flickered. My hand shook as I moved the mouse, waking the screen. What I saw made my blood run cold. A live feed from several rooms, including mine, was displayed on the monitor. There were also files, folders of saved videos, all labeled with room numbers and dates. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. This man had been spying on his guests, recording them in their most private moments. The horror of it sank in, freezing me in place. I thought of all the people who had stayed here, all of them unknowingly watched, violated. I was just another victim. I knew I had to do something. I looked around for a way to copy the footage, or at least destroy it, but I didn't have time. As I was searching, I heard the door creak behind me. The manager was standing there, his smile gone, replaced with a cold, dangerous look. "What do you think you're doing?" he asked, his voice low, almost calm, like he was talking to a misbehaving child. My mind raced. I was trapped, but I couldn't let him see how scared I was. I tried to stay calm, thinking of a way out. "You've been watching us," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You're sick. The police will be here soon." His expression didn't change. "You shouldn't have come in here. It's not what you think." But it was exactly what I thought. I could see the panic in his eyes now, the realization that he'd been caught. But instead of backing down, he moved closer, trying to block the door. I knew I had to act fast. Without thinking, I grabbed the first thing I could find, a heavy paperweight, and swung it at him. He stumbled back, shocked, giving me just enough time to push past him and run. I didn't look back. I sprinted down the hall, out of the office, and into the night. My car was the only one in the parking lot. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, but I managed to get in and start the engine. I sped out of there, the tires screeching on the asphalt. My heart pounded in my chest, adrenaline pumping through my veins. I drove for hours, not caring where I was going, just wanting to get as far away from that place as possible. Eventually, I pulled over at a gas station, my hands still shaking as I tried to process what had happened. I called the police, told them everything, but I knew it was too late. By the time they got there, he would be gone. And I was right. They never found him. The motel was empty when they arrived, like he had vanished into thin air. The experience left me scarred. I couldn't sleep in motels anymore, not without thinking of hidden cameras and that man's cold smile. Even now, when I check into a place, I find myself looking for things that don't seem right. A misplaced mirror, a clock that's too heavy. I don't think I'll ever feel safe again. I woke up in darkness. The air was heavy, the kind that made it hard to breathe. I blinked, trying to adjust my eyes, but the room stayed dark except for a thin line of light under the door. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, hoping to check the time, but there was nothing, just the smooth surface of the table. My phone was gone. I sat up quickly, my heart starting to pound. Where was my phone? I stumbled out of bed, reaching for the light switch. When the light flickered on, it barely lit the room. It was a small motel room, the kind you book when you're too tired to drive any further. But now, something felt wrong. I went to the door, trying to turn the knob, but it didn't move. I tried harder, twisting and pulling, but it was locked tight. I stared at the door, my mind racing. Who locks a door from the outside? I pounded on it, shouting for help, but no one answered. The motel seemed deserted. There wasn't even a sound from outside, not a car, not a voice. Just silence. Panic began to rise in my chest. I had to find a way out. I checked the windows next. Both were sealed shut, locked with thick screws. I couldn't budge them. I felt trapped, like a rat in a cage. I ran my hands along the walls, looking for something, anything that could help. Under the bed, behind the dresser, nothing. No phone, no tools, no way out. But then I noticed something odd, a small notebook on the nightstand that wasn't mine. I picked it up, my hands shaking as I flipped through the pages. At first, it looked like a normal notebook, but the handwriting was neat, too neat, like someone was writing very carefully. Then I saw it, my name. Over and over, my name was written, along with notes about me. He wakes up around 6 a.m. He eats cereal for breakfast. He leaves the room at 8:30. The notes continued, detailing every move I made since I checked in. I felt sick. Someone had been watching me, tracking everything I did. I dropped the notebook like it burned my fingers. My eyes darted around the room, suddenly aware that I wasn't alone. Someone had been here. Maybe they still were. That's when I saw it, the plate on the small table by the window. It had a half-eaten sandwich on it, the bread still soft, not mine. Next to it, a cigarette butt, still smoldering. My breath caught in my throat. Whoever had been here wasn't just watching. They were living here. They were close, maybe right outside the door. I needed to get out now. I grabbed the chair from the table and slammed it against the door, but it barely made a dent. I tried again, harder this time, but the door was solid, not budging at all. I backed away, chest heaving with fear. That's when I noticed the painting on the wall, slightly crooked. I'd seen it earlier but hadn't paid it much attention. Now, it seemed wrong, out of place. I yanked it down, revealing a small hole in the wall, big enough for someone to crawl through. Inside, there was a tiny space, just big enough to fit a person, and there was a mattress, old and dirty, with a few personal items scattered around, a toothbrush, a book, and a small radio. I felt dizzy as the realization hit me. Someone had been living here, right behind the wall, watching me sleep, slipping out when I wasn't looking. The thought made my skin crawl. I had to get out. I turned to run to the door, but then I heard it, the sound of a key turning in the lock. I froze. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. Someone was coming in. I looked around for a place to hide, but there was nowhere. The room was too small, too exposed. I thought about the hole behind the painting, but the idea of crawling in there, into that tiny, dark space, made me feel like I would suffocate. But I had no choice. I squeezed into the hole, pulling the painting back over the entrance. I tried to slow my breathing, but it was loud in my ears, echoing in the small space. I heard the door creak open, slow, deliberate. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel them. They were in the room, moving slowly, checking everything. My heart pounded louder and louder, drowning out everything else. Suddenly, there was a sharp knock on the wall right next to my head. I bit down on my lip to keep from screaming. They knew. They knew I was hiding. I could hear their breathing now, slow and steady, right outside the hole. My whole body tensed, waiting for them to pull the painting off the wall to drag me out. But then, the breathing stopped. The room went quiet again, too quiet. I waited, counting the seconds, but nothing happened. Finally, I dared to peek out from behind the painting. The room was empty. The door was open, swinging slightly in the breeze from the hallway. I crawled out, my legs shaking so badly I could barely stand. I needed to run, to get out of this place. but something made me stop. On the bed was my phone, placed neatly in the center of the pillow. The screen was lit up with a single message: "I'm not done yet." My blood ran cold. I grabbed the phone and ran out of the room, not looking back. I didn't stop running until I was outside, in the cold morning air, gasping for breath. I looked back at the motel, half expecting to see someone standing in the doorway, watching me. But there was nothing, just the empty doorway and the dark windows staring back at me. I never went back to that motel. I drove until I couldn't drive anymore, until the memory of that night felt like a bad dream. But every time I close my eyes, I see that message. And I wonder if they're still watching, waiting for the right moment to finish what they started. Last week, I checked into a motel off the highway. I was exhausted from driving all day, just trying to get to my next work meeting. The motel was one of those places that looked like it hadn't been touched since the 80s. Faded signs, peeling paint, and a dead silence that made me feel like I was the only person there. When I stepped inside the lobby, the old man at the counter barely looked up. He slid a key across the desk without a word. I didn't care. I just wanted a bed. The room wasn't much better. The wallpaper was yellowing, and the bedspread had stains I didn't want to think about. But it was a bed, and that was enough. I dropped my bag on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed, my body feeling heavy and my eyes burning from the long drive. The silence was almost too thick, making the room feel even smaller, like it was closing in on me. I shook it off, telling myself I was just tired. After a quick shower, I tried to relax, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I couldn't tell why, but something just felt off. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the creepy vibe of the motel getting to me. I turned on the TV to drown out the quiet, but the static-filled screen didn't help. I was about to give up and try to sleep when there was a knock on the door. It was a soft knock, but in that dead silence, it sounded like a hammer against the wood. I froze. Who would be knocking at this time? Maybe it was the old man from the lobby, but why? The knock came again, a little louder this time. I got up, my heart starting to beat faster. When I opened the door, I found a man standing there. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair messy, and his eyes darted around like he was nervous about something. "Are you alone?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. I didn't know what to say. Who was this guy? Why was he asking me that? He didn't wait for me to answer before he stepped closer. "You need to leave. Now. You're in danger." My first instinct was to slam the door, but something in his voice made me pause. There was something desperate, almost pleading in the way he spoke. But still, I didn't know him. He could be crazy. I tried to play it cool, shaking my head as I said, "I think you've got the wrong room." He shook his head quickly. "No, it's you. I know it's you. They're coming for you. You have to get out of here before it's too late." My heart pounded harder in my chest. How did he know anything about me? How did he even know I was here? I wanted to shut the door, to lock it and forget he ever knocked, but his words kept ringing in my ears. "They're coming for you." I stared at him, trying to figure out if he was lying, but he looked so sure, so scared. I felt something cold creeping into my gut. "Who's coming?" I finally asked. His face paled even more, and he glanced over his shoulder as if expecting someone to be standing there. "They're watching you. They've been watching you for a while. I was in your place once. I didn't listen, and they got me. You still have time, but not much." It was too much. I couldn't wrap my head around what he was saying. I almost laughed it off, thinking he was some lunatic, but the fear in his eyes was real. I tried to push him out of my mind, but the unease in my stomach was growing stronger, spreading to my chest. I managed to close the door, locking it behind me. My hands were shaking. I told myself he was crazy, just some weirdo trying to mess with me. But his words wouldn't leave me alone. I sat on the bed, staring at the door, trying to make sense of it all. My phone rang, startling me. I grabbed it, but when I answered, there was no one on the other end, just a low static that made my skin crawl. I hung up, telling myself it was nothing, but then it rang again. This time, I didn't answer. I just stared at the screen until it stopped. My mind was racing. The room felt too small, too dark, too quiet. I felt like I was being watched, like eyes were on me from every corner. I started to feel paranoid, my heart racing, my breath coming in quick gasps. What if he was right? What if someone really was after me? But why? What had I done? I kept asking myself these questions, but I had no answers. I tried to calm down, but every little sound made me jump. The shadows outside the window seemed to move on their own. The silence was no longer empty. It was heavy, filled with the weight of something unseen. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was going on. I opened the door, hoping the man was still out there, that he could explain more. But the hallway was empty, and the only sound was the faint buzz of a flickering light. Panic started to set in. I felt trapped, like the walls were closing in on me. I didn't want to believe him, but something in my gut told me I couldn't stay here. I decided to leave, to get out of that motel and never look back. I grabbed my bag, throwing things inside with trembling hands, but just as I reached the door, I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming closer. I froze, my heart pounding in my ears. The footsteps stopped outside my door, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, a single knock. I felt my blood turn to ice. I didn't know what to do. I backed away from the door, my hands shaking so hard I could barely hold on to my bag. The knock came again, and I nearly screamed. I had to get out, but the only way was through that door. I took a deep breath, trying to gather the courage to open it. But then I saw him, standing in the corner of the room, the man from before. Only now he wasn't scared. He was smiling. "I told you they were coming," he said, his voice calm, almost cheerful. "But you didn't listen. Now it's too late." My mind went blank. How did he get in? I didn't hear the door open. I didn't see him come in. I tried to run, but he moved faster, blocking my way. His smile grew wider, and in that moment, I knew. He wasn't a victim. He was the one I should have been afraid of all along. I backed up until I hit the wall, trapped, with nowhere to go. The last thing I heard was the sound of the door creaking open, and then everything went dark. I was driving for hours when I saw the sign. "Motel, vacancy," it read, the flickering light barely noticeable through the thick fog. My eyes were heavy, and the thought of spending another hour on the road seemed unbearable. So, I turned in. The place looked like it hadn't seen guests in years. The paint was peeling, and the only sound was the distant hum of the highway. The lobby was dark except for a dim lamp on the front desk, casting long shadows that made me uneasy. I hesitated, but then I thought, it's just one night. As I approached the desk, a strong smell hit me, like old meat, rotting. I tried to ignore it, blaming it on the old building. The motel was empty, not a soul in sight, so I rang the bell on the desk. The noise echoed, but no one came. I noticed a dark stain on the counter. It looked like rust, but when I touched it, it felt sticky. I pulled my hand back quickly, wiping it on my pants, trying to shake the discomfort. A few minutes later, a man appeared from a back room. He was old, his skin pale and eyes tired. He didn't say much, just handed me a key, his hands trembling slightly. I asked if there were other guests, trying to make small talk, but he just shook his head and disappeared again. The room was no better. It smelled damp, and the bed looked like it hadn't been made properly in a long time. The sheets were wrinkled, and as I pulled them back, I noticed a tear in the fabric. The mirror on the wall was cracked, and when I looked closer, I saw scratches on the floor, deep and uneven. It looked like someone had dragged something heavy across the room. Or someone. I couldn't sleep. The noises in the motel were too strange. Every few minutes I heard creaking, like someone was walking slowly just outside my door. But each time I checked, the hallway was empty. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just the old building settling. But my gut told me something was wrong. I needed to know more. So I started looking around. In the closet, I found a pile of clothes, dusty and stained with dark spots. I pulled out a shirt, and it was stiff, like it had dried with something thick on it. I felt sick to my stomach. That's when I saw it. A small book, half buried under the clothes. It was a diary. The entries were short, talking about a road trip, just like mine. But as the pages went on, the tone changed. The writer mentioned hearing noises, feeling watched, and then they described a man who wouldn't stop staring at them through the lobby window. The last entry was unfinished, ending abruptly with, "He's coming." My hands were shaking. I could barely breathe. That's when I heard it again, the creaking, but this time it was louder, closer. I realized then I wasn't alone. The motel wasn't empty. I turned off the light, moving slowly to the door. I pressed my ear against it and heard faint breathing. Panic set in. I tried to stay calm, but my mind was racing. I pieced it all together. The stains, the diary, the strange man at the front desk. This place wasn't safe. People had disappeared here. I might be next. I needed to leave. I grabbed my things, moving as quietly as I could. But when I tried the door, it wouldn't budge. I tried harder, but it felt like it was locked from the outside. My heart pounded in my chest. I ran to the window, pulling back the curtains, but it was nailed shut. Desperation took over. I dialed 911, my hands shaking so badly I could barely press the buttons. The signal was weak, the call cutting in and out. I tried to explain, but I didn't know if they understood. All I heard was static. Then the line went dead. The footsteps were getting closer. I could hear them right outside the door. I hid in the closet, covering myself with the old clothes, trying to steady my breathing. The door creaked open, and I heard someone step inside. I could see through the crack in the closet door, a shadow moving slowly across the room. I held my breath, hoping they wouldn't find me. But then, the closet door started to open. I closed my eyes, praying it was all a nightmare, that I would wake up safe in my bed. But I wasn't dreaming. This was real. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the figure standing over me, a twisted smile on their face. And then, nothing. I woke up to silence. The room was empty, the door wide open. I stumbled out, disoriented, but the motel was as silent as before, like nothing had happened. But I knew better. I knew what I had seen, what I had felt. I ran to my car, not caring about the rest of my things, and drove away as fast as I could. I don't know if anyone will believe me. I barely believe it myself. But if you ever see a no vacancy sign at a lonely motel, keep driving. Don't stop, no matter how tired you are. Because some places, they're not meant for people like us. They're traps. And if you're not careful, you'll never leave. I booked the cheapest hotel I could find on a business trip. It wasn't much, just a small room with a bed and a desk, but it was enough for one night. I didn't expect luxury, just a place to sleep. But sleep was hard to come by that night. It started with a noise. At first, I thought it was just the usual hotel sounds, people walking by, doors closing, that sort of thing. But this was different. It was coming from the room next door. It started as a faint thumping, like someone was tapping on the wall. It wasn't constant, just enough to be annoying. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was nothing, but it kept happening. Then I heard a low moan. It was soft, almost like a person in pain. My skin prickled, and I felt a sense of unease settle in my stomach. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination. I was tired, stressed from work, and maybe I was just hearing things. But the sounds didn't stop. They got louder, more disturbing. The moaning turned into something that sounded like a muffled cry. My heart started to race, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to see what was going on. Maybe someone was hurt, or maybe it was just some stupid prank. But I needed to know. I got out of bed and crept to the door. The hallway was dimly lit, quiet except for the sounds coming from next door. I walked over, my footsteps barely making a sound on the worn carpet. When I reached the door, I noticed it was slightly ajar. A thin line of light spilled into the hallway. I hesitated. Something in my gut told me to turn around, go back to my room, and pretend I didn't hear anything. But curiosity got the better of me. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking softly. The light was dim, just a small lamp on the nightstand casting a weak glow over the room. The first thing I noticed was the mess. The bed was unmade, sheets tangled and half off the mattress. There was a suitcase on the floor, clothes strewn around it like someone had been in a hurry. A chair was knocked over and the lamp on the desk was broken, the shade askew. It looked like there had been a struggle, but there was no one there. My heart was pounding in my chest as I stepped inside, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, with a faint smell of bleach lingering in the room. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened here. I took a few more steps, my eyes scanning the room for any sign of life, but it was empty. Then I saw it, a small stain on the carpet near the bed. I moved closer, my stomach turning as I realized what it was. Blood. It wasn't much, just a small dark patch, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. I looked around the room again, more carefully this time, and my eyes landed on the nightstand. There was a wallet sitting there, half open, with cards and cash spilling out. I reached for it, my hands trembling. When I saw the ID inside, my heart nearly stopped. It was the man I'd seen earlier in the hallway, the one who had smiled at me as we passed each other. I remembered his friendly face, the way he had nodded at me, and now his wallet was here, in this room that looked like a crime scene. Panic set in. I dropped the wallet and backed away, my mind racing. What the hell had happened here? Where was the man? And who had done this? The fear that someone was still watching me, maybe even waiting for me to leave the room, was overwhelming. I had to get out of there. I turned and ran out of the room, not caring how much noise I made. The hallway was empty, too quiet, and it felt like the walls were closing in on me. I rushed back to my room, slammed the door shut, and locked it. My heart was still racing, and my mind was a blur of thoughts. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? But what if they thought I was involved? I hadn't touched anything, but my fingerprints were probably all over that door. And what if the person who did this was still nearby? I couldn't stay there. I had to leave. I grabbed my bag, not bothering to pack it properly, and headed for the exit. I didn't care about checking out or getting my deposit back. I just wanted to be far away from that place. As I drove away, my hands were shaking so badly that I could barely keep the wheel steady. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me, but the road behind me was empty. The hotel quickly disappeared from view, but the fear didn't leave me. It stayed with me, a constant gnawing feeling in my gut. For days after, I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen. I searched online for any news about the hotel, anything that might explain what happened, but there was nothing. No reports of violence, no missing persons, no mention of anything unusual. It was like it never happened. But I know what I saw. I know that something terrible happened in that room. I've tried to convince myself that I imagined it, that maybe the stress of work and lack of sleep made me see things that weren't there. But deep down, I know the truth. Something did happen, and the fact that there's no record of it makes it even worse. It's like the world moved on, forgetting whatever horror took place in that room, leaving me alone with the memory. And the worst part? I'll never know what really happened. The last guest. I was exhausted, driving through the night on a lonely stretch of highway, desperate to find somewhere to sleep. The glow of a neon motel sign caught my eye, and I pulled in without much thought. The building looked old and worn out, with just a few cars scattered in the parking lot. The reception area was dimly lit, and the only sound was the hum of a flickering light above. The old man behind the desk barely looked up as I entered. He seemed bored, tired, like he'd been sitting there for too long. When I asked for a room, he hesitated, glancing up from the book he was reading. His eyes lingered on me for a moment, as if he was sizing me up before finally handing me a key. "Room at the end of the hall," he said, his voice raspy. "It's the quietest." There was something off about the way he said it, but I was too tired to care. I thanked him and dragged myself down the dimly lit hallway. The place had a strange smell, a mix of dampness and something I couldn't quite place. My room was small and musty, the kind of place you stay just to get some sleep and leave as soon as you can. I threw my bag on the bed and noticed how cold it was inside, even though it was warm outside. That first night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I tried to brush it off, blaming it on my tired mind. But when I lay down to sleep, I started hearing noises. At first, it was just the usual creaks and groans of an old building, but then there were whispers, soft and indistinct, like they were just out of earshot. I sat up in bed, listening hard, but the noises stopped as soon as I tried to focus on them. Morning came, and I felt even more uneasy. My suitcase was slightly open, though I clearly remembered closing it. Maybe I was just being paranoid, I thought, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been in the room. I decided to mention it to the old man at reception, but when I did, he just shrugged. "Keys are one of a kind," he said, his tone dismissive. "No one else has access." I didn't believe him, but I had no proof. I spent the day out, trying to clear my head, but the uneasy feeling stayed with me. When I returned to my room that evening, I noticed that the bed looked different, like someone else had been lying on it. There was also a faint imprint on the pillow next to mine, one that definitely wasn't there when I left. My heart raced as I checked the door, finding it locked just as I had left it. I started locking the door every time I stepped out, but that didn't stop the feeling of being watched. The next day, I met another guest, a man who looked just as uneasy as I felt. We started talking, and he mentioned something that made my blood run cold. He told me that the last person to stay in my room had disappeared without a trace. His voice trembled as he spoke, his eyes darting around as if he was afraid someone might overhear. "They never found him," he said, lowering his voice. "That room, something's wrong with it. You should leave." I tried to brush it off, telling myself that the man was just paranoid, maybe even a little crazy. But his words stuck with me, gnawing at the edges of my mind. That night, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. I couldn't make out the words, but they felt close, like they were coming from right beside me. I turned on the lights, trying to chase away the darkness, but it only made things worse. The carpet near the bed had faint, dusty footprints leading to where I was standing. I froze, fear gripping me. The footprints were small, like a child's, and they were coming toward me. Panic took over. I grabbed my bag, fumbling with the lock on the door, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if they were right in my ear now. I banged on the door, screaming for help, but no one came. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in on me. My vision blurred as I struggled to breathe, the whispers now a deafening roar in my mind. And then, everything went black. I woke up the next morning on the floor, disoriented and confused. The room was silent, the whispers gone. My bag was still by the door, the lock now easy to open. I stumbled out, barely able to stand, and found the old man waiting at the reception. He didn't look surprised to see me in such a state. "You saw someone, didn't you?" he asked, his voice calm, almost amused. I nodded, too shaken to speak. The police were called, and when they arrived, they questioned me about what had happened. I told them everything, but I could see they didn't believe me. They mentioned that the previous guest had left behind a note before he disappeared. The note only had one line, but it sent chills down my spine. "You're never really alone." I left the motel that day, driving as fast as I could, trying to put as much distance between me and that place as possible. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that something followed me. The memory of that night haunts me, and sometimes, when I'm alone, I swear I can still hear those whispers. As I pulled away, I glanced in my rearview mirror. The old man at the reception was there, watching me leave, a small smile on his face as he handed a key to a new guest. I didn't expect my trip to turn into a nightmare. It was supposed to be just a simple road trip, nothing special. I was driving through a small town in the middle of nowhere, just trying to make it to the next big city by morning. But I was tired, so I pulled into a rundown motel on the side of the road, thinking I'd catch a few hours of sleep before continuing. The motel was old, paint peeling off the walls, and the neon sign flickered weakly in the dark. It looked like the kind of place you only see in movies where bad things happen, but I was too tired to care. The check-in process was quick, and the man at the front desk barely looked up from his phone as he handed me the key. Room 7. I parked my car in front of the room and grabbed my bag from the back seat. That's when I saw it. Across the parking lot, near the entrance, a man was dragging a small child by the arm. The kid couldn't have been older than 6 or 7. The man looked rough, unshaven, wearing a dirty jacket. The kid was struggling, trying to pull away, but the man tightened his grip and pulled harder. My heart pounded. I knew something was wrong. I couldn't just ignore it. I hurried to the front desk, nearly tripping over my own feet in the process. The guy behind the desk barely looked up again when I burst in. "Hey, there's a man outside. He's dragging a kid. Something's not right." The man at the desk sighed, putting down his phone. "There's no kid staying here," he said, like I was bothering him with my concerns. "But I just saw—" "No kid," he repeated, cutting me off. His eyes finally met mine, and there was something cold in them. "You must be tired. Get some sleep." Frustrated, I left the office, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I decided to call the police. When they arrived, I explained everything, but by then, there was no sign of the man or the child. The cops talked to the motel staff, who all claimed they hadn't seen anything. The few other guests who were awake also denied noticing anything unusual. The police looked at me like I was wasting their time, and without any evidence, they left. I went back to my room, but I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the scene in my head, wondering if I had imagined it. But it felt so real. I couldn't ignore it. The next day, I started looking online, trying to find any news about missing kids in the area. That's when I found the articles. There were stories about children disappearing from small motels just like this one. The descriptions were eerily similar. Kids last seen in parking lots, dragged away by unidentified men. But the most disturbing part was that none of these cases had been solved. The kids were never found. My hands shook as I scrolled through the reports. The motel I was staying at was mentioned in one of them. I felt sick. Could this place be involved in something much bigger, something terrible? I had to find out more. I started noticing things. The way the staff watched me, the way their conversations would suddenly stop when I walked by. Once, I returned to my room and found my belongings moved around, though nothing was missing. It was like someone had searched through my things. My paranoia grew and I knew I had to leave. But when I tried to start my car, it wouldn't turn over. The engine just clicked. I tried my phone, but there was no signal, even though I'd had full bars earlier. It felt like I was trapped, like they were making sure I couldn't leave. Desperate, I sneaked into the motel office that night. I'd seen the front desk guy leave earlier, so I knew it would be empty. I searched through the drawers and cabinets, looking for anything that could explain what was going on. In a dusty corner, I found an old ledger hidden behind a stack of papers. When I opened it, my blood ran cold. The ledger was filled with names, dates, and descriptions of children. Some of the names matched the ones from the missing persons reports I had found online. The last entry was from 2 days ago, the same night I saw the child in the parking lot. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The staff had to be involved. This place was a front for something horrible. I felt sick, but I knew I had to get out of there, and fast. As I was putting the ledger back, I heard footsteps approaching. Panic surged through me, and I quickly slipped out the back door just as the front door opened. I ran to my room, grabbed my bag, and headed for the window. I was in such a hurry that I didn't even care about the noise I made. The glass shattered as I forced it open, and I crawled out, cutting my arm on a shard. Blood dripped down, but I didn't stop. I ran into the night, the ledger clutched tightly in my hand. I didn't look back. I didn't know if anyone was following me, but I didn't care. I just kept running until I reached the main road. I finally got a signal and called for help. But even as I told the police what had happened, I knew they might not believe me. I sounded crazy, but the ledger, maybe that would be enough. Now I'm sitting in a diner, trying to process everything. The police took the ledger, but they wouldn't let me leave town until they had more answers. They said they're investigating, but I can see it in their eyes. They don't really believe me. Maybe they think I'm just some paranoid traveler, seeing things that aren't there. But I know what I saw. I know what's happening in that motel. The worst part is, I don't think this is over. I have a feeling they know where I am. The motel isn't far, and who knows how deep this thing goes. I'm scared, but I can't just run away. I need to make sure someone listens, that the truth comes out. But if I disappear, please, don't let them cover it up. Don't let this happen to someone else. I didn't expect much from the motel. After driving for hours, all I wanted was a bed and a shower. I saw the vacancy sign from the highway and took the next exit. The place looked old, run down. The neon sign buzzed, flickering as if it was struggling to stay alive. It wasn't inviting, but at that moment, I didn't care. I just needed to sleep. The lobby was empty, except for an old man behind the desk. He looked at me with dull eyes, not really caring who I was. I paid for the room in cash. He slid the key across the counter without a word. Room 12. I took the key and headed down the dim hallway. The air was stale and the carpet felt sticky under my shoes. A shiver ran down my spine, but I told myself it was just from being tired. When I opened the door to my room, the first thing that hit me was the smell, mold, mixed with something else, something metallic. The walls were stained yellow, and the bedspread looked like it hadn't been washed in weeks. The mirror on the wall had a crack running through it, distorting my reflection. As I looked at myself, something in the mirror caught my eye. A quick flicker, like a light turning on and off. But when I turned around, nothing seemed out of place. Just my imagination, I thought, brushing it off. I was too tired to care. I threw my bag on the chair and sat on the edge of the bed, my body aching from the drive. I pulled out my phone, checking for messages, but the signal was weak. I sighed, tossing the phone aside, and headed to the bathroom to splash water on my face. That's when I noticed it, a small blinking light in the air vent above the bed. My heart skipped a beat as I realized what it was. A camera. I froze, staring at the tiny red light, my mind racing. How long had it been there? How much had it seen? Panic washed over me. Someone was watching. Someone had been watching the whole time. I should have left. Any sane person would have grabbed their stuff and run, but I didn't. I don't know why. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe I just couldn't believe what was happening. Instead of leaving, I stayed, my eyes locked on that blinking light. And then I made a decision that I still regret. I decided to find out more. I left my room, quietly, hoping no one would notice. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the flickering bulbs above. I made my way to the front desk, but the old man was gone. There was a door behind the counter, slightly ajar. I hesitated for a moment before pushing it open. Inside, I found a small room filled with old electronics. Monitors lined the walls, each showing a different room in the motel. Every room had a camera. Every guest was being watched, just like me. I felt sick. This wasn't just some pervert with a hidden camera. This was something much worse. I was about to turn and run when I noticed a drawer under the monitors. It was filled with tapes and files, each labeled with a room number and a name. My hands trembled as I pulled one out and opened it. Inside were detailed notes. Everything about the guest, their habits, when they slept, when they showered. And at the bottom of each file, a date was written in red ink. Execution. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just about watching people. Whoever was behind this was planning something far worse. I didn't want to find out what it was. I turned to leave, but as I did, I heard footsteps approaching. Someone was coming. My heart pounded in my chest. I had to get out now. I pushed the drawer closed and darted out of the room, slipping back into the hallway just as the footsteps reached the door. I moved quickly, trying not to make a sound. I was almost at my room when I saw him, the old man from the front desk. He was standing at the end of the hallway staring at me. His eyes were different now, no longer dull, but sharp, knowing. He didn't move, didn't say anything, just watched as I backed away slowly. Then, a smile spread across his face. A cold, calculating smile. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I ran to my room, grabbed my bag, and bolted out the door. I didn't look back, not until I was in my car, speeding down the highway. My heart was racing as I drove, trying to put as much distance between me and that place as possible. But even as I left the motel behind, the fear didn't go away. My mind kept replaying the images from the monitors, the files, that blinking light. I needed to get out of there, far away. A few miles down the road, I pulled into a gas station. I needed to catch my breath, to calm down. As I sat in the car, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and that's when I saw it. A small blinking light hidden behind the mirror. I stared at it, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. It was the same light, the same blinking red dot. Somehow it had followed me. Or maybe I had never left it behind. That's when I realized there was no escape. I was tired. Life had been a mess lately. Work, bills, and everything in between. I needed a break, just a few days to clear my head. That's when I saw the ad online. It was a small motel, far from the city. The photos made it look perfect, simple, quiet, and cheap. The kind of place where you could lose yourself for a while and come back feeling whole again. I booked it without thinking twice. When I arrived, something didn't feel right. The road leading to the motel was narrow and full of potholes, with no signs pointing the way. The motel itself looked older than in the pictures. The paint was peeling and the windows were dark. There were no other cars in the lot, just mine. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just a slow day, or maybe I was the only one who had found this hidden gem. I walked inside, trying to push the uneasy feeling out of my mind. The receptionist was a woman in her 50s, with a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. She handed me a key without saying much, just nodding when I asked if there were other guests. She didn't even look at me. The whole place was quiet, too quiet. But I was tired, and I just wanted to get to my room. The room was small but clean, though the bed looked like it hadn't been used in a while. There was a door on the side, locked from the outside. I figured it was a storage room or something, but it still made me feel weird. I tried calling a friend to let them know I had arrived, but there was no signal. The landline in the room was dead too. I thought maybe it was just this remote location. No signal, no internet. I tried to relax, telling myself it was what I wanted, a break from everything. That night, I heard noises. It was late, and I was half asleep, but I heard something, like footsteps, or maybe dragging sounds. I got up and looked out the window, but I didn't see anything. The hallway outside my room was empty too. I tried to go back to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next day, I started noticing more things that didn't add up. The staff was barely around. When I went to the front desk, no one was there. I saw cameras in the hallways, but they were old, almost hidden behind the dust. And then, there was that locked door in my room. I tried turning the handle, even knocking, but it was solid. Something about it made me uncomfortable. Later, I found something under the bed. An old wallet. It was dusty, like it had been there for a while. Inside were cards, IDs, all belonging to someone else. A man who didn't seem like he would just leave his stuff behind. That's when it hit me. This place wasn't right. People had been here before, and they hadn't left. Panic set in. I tried leaving, but the main door was locked and the windows wouldn't open. I ran through the motel, trying every door, but they were all locked too. I was trapped. The receptionist was gone, no staff in sight. The cameras, those old dusty cameras, were watching me, and I knew someone was on the other side, seeing everything I did. I had to get out. I couldn't stay here, waiting to find out what happened to the others. I decided to pretend everything was fine, like I hadn't figured out anything. I returned to my room and waited for nightfall. When I heard footsteps outside, I knew it was my chance. I slipped out, avoiding the cameras, moving as quietly as I could. I found a door that led to the back of the motel. It was locked, but the lock was old, and after a few tries, I managed to break it. I ran. I didn't care where, just away from that place. The road was dark, no lights, no signs, but I kept running. I thought I was safe when I saw a car's headlights in the distance. Relief flooded me, and I waved them down. But as the car got closer, I recognized it. It was the receptionist, her face cold and unreadable. I turned to run again, but the other staff, who I hadn't seen before, stepped out of the shadows, surrounding me. They grabbed me, dragging me back to the motel. I screamed. I fought, but it was no use. They were stronger, and they had done this before. As they pulled me back inside, I saw the cameras, the same ones I thought I had outsmarted, still following me. They had been watching me the whole time, knowing I would try to escape, playing along with my plan until I led myself right into their trap. I don't know what will happen next. Maybe I'll end up like the others, just another forgotten guest in a forgotten motel. Maybe someone will find this story, but I doubt it. They've been doing this for a long time and they're good at it. Too good. If you ever see a cheap ad for a remote motel that seems too good to be true, stay away. Don't end up like me. I stayed at the Sunset Motel because it was cheap and close to the highway. I didn't plan to sleep in, but when I opened my eyes, the clock showed 11:30 a.m. Checkout was at 11. My heart raced as I threw the covers off and scrambled to gather my things. I tried to leave, but the door wouldn't open. I turned the knob and pushed, but it was stuck. My chest tightened. What was happening? I slammed my shoulder against the door and finally it gave way. My phone was dead, so I couldn't call for help. I was already sweating as I rushed to the front desk. The lobby was empty, but a man stood behind the counter. His smile was wide, too wide, like he had practiced it in front of a mirror for too long. He didn't greet me, just stared. I missed checkout. I'm sorry. I'll pay the extra fee. I just need to get going, I said, trying to sound calm. His smile didn't move. You missed the checkout time. That's not allowed. His voice was cold, flat, like he was reading from a script. He picked up a small bell and rang it. The sound echoed through the empty lobby. I felt a chill run down my spine. I can pay. Just let me pay and I'll leave. He tilted his head, still smiling. No one leaves once they miss checkout. I laughed nervously, thinking it was some kind of joke, but the way he stared back made me stop. I don't have time for this, I muttered, heading for the door. But it wouldn't open. I yanked the handle, but it was locked. I looked back at the man behind the desk, but he was gone. Panic surged through me as I slammed my fists against the glass, calling out for help. No one answered. I saw a couple walking down the hallway, and I ran to them. Hey, the door's locked, and the guy at the front desk is gone. Do you know how to get out of here? They didn't even look at me. The woman whispered something to the man, and they hurried away, avoiding eye contact. Their behavior made my skin crawl. What the hell is going on? I whispered to myself. I tried another door, then another, but they were all locked. I went back to the lobby, hoping to find a key, something, anything to get me out. But the man behind the counter was there again, as if he had never moved. His smile hadn't changed. Please, let me out, I begged. You missed checkout, he said again. That's not allowed. I felt like I was going crazy. I started pounding on the doors, shouting for help, but nobody came. I thought about breaking a window, but I didn't want to make things worse. I went back to my room to find something I could use to force the door open. But when I got there, a woman in a maid's uniform was standing in the hallway, her back to me. She turned slowly, her eyes dark and hollow, and I realized she wasn't here to help me. You missed checkout, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I stumbled back, the fear choking me. I tried to run, but the hallway seemed to stretch on forever. I turned a corner and ran into another guest, a man this time, but his eyes were the same, empty. You missed checkout, he said, grabbing my arm. I broke free and ran, my mind racing with panic. I found a door that led to the kitchen and locked it behind me. My hands were shaking as I searched for something, anything to defend myself with. I grabbed a knife, holding it tight. I could hear footsteps outside the door, soft but getting closer. They knew I was here. I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew I had to get out, or I'd never leave. The door handle turned slowly, and I braced myself, ready to fight. But the door didn't open. Instead, I heard voices outside. I pressed my ear to the door and heard the staff talking in low, cold tones. They always try to leave. They don't understand. No one leaves after checkout. What do we do with him? Same as the others. No one will notice he's gone. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away from the door. They were planning to kill me. I had to get out now. I looked around, realizing my only option was the window. I hurried to it, but it was small, barely big enough for me to squeeze through. I climbed onto the counter, pushing the window open. The cold air hit my face, but before I could pull myself out, the door to the kitchen burst open. The man from the front desk was there, his smile gone, replaced with a look of cold determination. I screamed and kicked out, hitting him in the chest. He stumbled back, and I used the moment to pull myself through the window. I fell to the ground outside, the knife clattering beside me. I grabbed it and ran, not looking back. The motel was surrounded by woods, thick and dark, but I didn't care. I ran into them, branches scratching my face and arms, the knife still in my hand. I ran until I couldn't run anymore, collapsing onto the ground, gasping for breath. I didn't know where I was or if they were still following me. I just knew I had to keep moving. I forced myself to get up, to keep walking. But the further I went, the more I realized something was wrong. I wasn't getting anywhere. The woods seemed to circle back on themselves, no matter which way I went. And then I heard the voices again, coming from the trees. "You missed checkout. That's not allowed." I dropped the knife and ran again, but the voices followed me. They were closer now, surrounding me. I fell to my knees, exhausted, and looked up to see the man from the front desk standing in front of me, smiling. "You can't leave," he said, his voice echoing in my head. And that's when I knew I was never getting out of there. I had been driving for hours, and exhaustion had begun to creep into my bones. I was in the middle of nowhere, just a stretch of road surrounded by trees. When I saw the sign for a motel, I didn't hesitate. The building looked old, the neon sign flickering like it might give up any second. But all I cared about was a bed and some sleep. The receptionist, a woman in her late 40s with tired eyes, handed me the key to room 204. The key was an actual metal one, attached to a large plastic tag. "Breakfast at 7, she said, almost as an afterthought. I nodded, eager to just get to my room. Room 204 was exactly what I expected. Plain, with a bed, a small table, and a TV that probably hadn't worked in years. The wallpaper was peeling at the edges, and the carpet had seen better days. But it was clean enough, and at that moment, it felt like luxury. I tossed my bag on the bed, freshened up, and decided to grab something to eat before crashing. When I came back from dinner, the night had settled in, thick and quiet. I walked up to the door, but something made me pause. The number on the door looked different, faded, almost as if someone had scratched at it. The 4 wasn't as clear as before. Maybe I was just tired, I thought, and pushed the key into the lock. As soon as I stepped inside, I knew something was wrong. The room felt off. The bed was on the opposite wall, the wallpaper was a dull yellow instead of the blue I remembered, and there were no signs of my belongings. It was as if the room had been flipped. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of it. Did I walk into the wrong room? But no, this was 204. At least it should have been. Confused, I stepped out and looked at the number again. The faded 4 was now a 2. Room 202. I checked my phone for the reservation email. Room 204, clear as day. I went back to the front desk, holding on to my last thread of patience. The same woman was there, but when I told her my problem, she looked at me like I was crazy. Room 204? she repeated. "We don't have a room 204, and I don't remember checking you in." My heart sank. "You gave me the key," I insisted, pulling it out of my pocket. The tag now read 202. I stared at it, my mind scrambling for an explanation. "Must be a mistake," she said, her tone flat. "But we don't have a 204. You can stay in 202 if you like." I left the desk, my head spinning. Nothing made sense. I returned to the room, 202 now, and sat on the bed, which didn't feel familiar anymore. I tried to convince myself that I was just overtired, that I had made a mistake. But deep down, panic was creeping in. I needed proof. I checked my wallet for the room receipt, but found nothing. I had a vague memory of putting it in my pocket, but now it was gone. I pulled out my phone to check the motel's reviews, hoping to see some mention of a room 204. The internet wasn't working. I tried to connect again and again, but nothing. Determined, I walked around the motel, hoping to find someone who might have seen me earlier, someone who could confirm that I had checked into 204. But when I approached the other guests, they just shook their heads. "Never seen you before," one of them said. I returned to my room, now certain something was very wrong. But I didn't know what to do. My memory felt unreliable, like I was losing track of what was real and what wasn't. I decided to stay awake, to keep my mind clear. Around midnight, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to know what was happening. I sneaked out and went back to where 204 should have been. The door was ajar. I stepped inside and found it empty. There were no signs of anyone staying there. No bags, no toiletries, nothing. I checked the guest book at the front desk, and my name was crossed out, like it had never been there in the first place. But there were other names too, erased like mine. My breath caught in my throat as I realized that this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me. The receptionist stood in the doorway, her face expressionless. "You shouldn't be here," she said in a low voice. The lights flickered and went out. I was plunged into darkness, my heartbeat the only sound. When the lights came back on, I found myself standing outside, in front of the motel. But it was different. The building was dark, the windows boarded up, and the sign was no longer flickering. It was dead. The neon tubes shattered. I backed away, my mind racing. Had I been there at all? My car was still in the parking lot, but the place looked abandoned, like it had been that way for years. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I started running, not knowing where to go, just needing to get away. As I ran, I thought I heard my name. Faint, carried on the wind, coming from the direction of the motel. But I didn't look back. I kept running, because whatever was in that motel, whatever had happened to room 204, I knew it was still there. And it knew my name. I was tired. Too tired to keep driving. The sun had set hours ago, and the road ahead stretched into the dark like a never-ending ribbon. When I saw the flickering neon sign for a motel, I decided to pull over. It wasn't like I had many options left. The place looked worn down, the paint peeling off the walls, but I figured I could sleep anywhere for one night. The old man at the front desk barely looked up when I asked for a room. His face was blank, like he was just going through the motions. He handed me a key with a room number, mumbled something about checkout time, and then went back to staring at the small TV behind him. I could hear it playing some late-night infomercial, but I didn't care enough to listen. The room was just as run down as the rest of the place. Faded wallpaper, a musty smell, and a dim light bulb that barely lit up the space. But the bed looked okay, and that was all I needed. I threw my bag on the chair, kicked off my shoes, and pulled back the covers, ready to collapse. That's when I saw them, the stains. At first, I thought it was just dirt. Maybe the sheets hadn't been cleaned properly, but the stains were dark, almost black, and they were dry and rough to the touch. My stomach turned. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that I was just being paranoid because I was exhausted. But it was hard to shake the feeling that something was wrong, really wrong. I didn't want to sleep in that bed, but where else could I go? It was too late to find another motel, and I was too tired to drive. So I lay down on the far side, trying to avoid the stains, but they were all I could think about. They seemed too dark to be just dirt or even old coffee. As I stared at them, my mind started racing, thinking about all the possible ways those stains could have ended up on the sheets. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I imagined someone bleeding out, struggling, fighting for their life right there in that bed. The stains seemed like silent witnesses to something terrible, something violent. It was probably my tired mind playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling. The hours dragged by, and eventually I must have fallen asleep because I woke up to the dim morning light sneaking through the dirty curtains. I couldn't stay in that room any longer. I needed answers. Maybe talking to someone would help ease my mind. I went down to the front desk and asked the old man about the stains. He barely reacted, just shrugged, and said something about old accidents and don't worry about it. But the way he avoided looking at me, the way he quickly changed the subject, made my skin crawl. He knew something, but he wasn't going to tell me. I couldn't let it go. I had to know more. So I pulled out my phone and started searching. It didn't take long to find news articles about violent crimes in the area. Murders, assaults, disappearances. Some of them even mentioned this motel by name. It wasn't just some run-down place on the side of the road. It had a history, and not a good one. I found stories about people who had checked in and never checked out. Their bodies were found days later, their last moments spent in those rooms. As I read more, I felt the blood drain from my face. The details were too close, too familiar. Each article described a scene that could explain the stains on those sheets. It wasn't just a coincidence. It couldn't be. I went back to the room, my heart pounding in my chest. I needed to see the stains again, to understand. When I looked closer, it was like I could see the struggle, the pain. The sheets weren't just dirty. They were telling a story. Each stain seemed to be a mark left behind by someone who had fought for their life. I started to panic. What if I was next? What if this room was a trap, waiting for its next victim? I wanted to leave, but something stopped me. A part of me needed to know the truth, even if it terrified me. I started searching the room, checking under the bed, behind the furniture. I don't know what I was expecting to find, but when I pulled up the edge of the bedspread and saw something sticking out from under the mattress, my breath caught in my throat. It was a piece of clothing, torn and stained with blood. I felt sick, like I was going to throw up right there. This wasn't just in my head. This was real. Someone had been hurt, maybe even killed in this room, and I was lying in the same bed, surrounded by their last moments. I couldn't stay another second. I grabbed my bag, not even bothering to pack properly, and ran out of the room. My hands were shaking so badly that I fumbled with the keys as I tried to start the car. Finally, the engine roared to life, and I sped out of the parking lot, not caring about the speed limit, not caring about anything except getting as far away from that place as possible. Even now, as I'm writing this, I can't stop thinking about those stains. I keep wondering if I'll ever feel safe again. Maybe it's just my imagination, but I can't shake the feeling that I've been marked, that somehow that room's dark history has attached itself to me. The stains might be behind me, but the memories, the fear, they're still there, as clear as ever. I don't know if I'll ever be able to sleep again without seeing them, without feeling like I'm still lying in that bed, waiting for whatever horror came before to find me. I should have known something was wrong when I pulled into the parking lot. The neon sign buzzed and flickered, half the letters dark, leaving only Motel glowing faintly in the night. But I was so tired from the long drive, and it was late, way past midnight. The road had been empty for miles, just darkness and my headlights cutting through it. I told myself it didn't matter, just a place to sleep for a few hours. I parked my car and walked towards the entrance, the gravel crunching under my boots. The lobby was small and dimly lit, with a smell I couldn't quite place, something old and sour. The man behind the counter didn't ask for my ID. He didn't even look at me properly, just slid the key across the counter with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I thought it was weird, but I was too tired to care. My head was already halfway on the pillow. The room was worse. The wallpaper was peeling, and the bed looked like it hadn't been changed in days. The smell from the lobby was stronger here, like something had been spilled and never cleaned up. I wanted to leave, but I convinced myself it was fine. I could endure it for one night. I was too tired to keep driving, too tired to care. So I threw my bag on the chair, kicked off my shoes, and collapsed onto the bed. That's when I started hearing the noises. At first it was just whispers, so faint I thought it was my imagination. But then there were footsteps, quick and hurried, like someone running down the hall. And then something heavy being dragged, scraping along the floor. The walls were so thin, it sounded like it was happening right next to me. I tried to ignore it, told myself it was just other guests, nothing to worry about. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to those noises, my heart beating faster with every minute that passed. Sleep was impossible. My mind was racing, filled with thoughts I couldn't control. I decided I needed to see what was going on. Maybe it would put my mind at ease. Or maybe I was just too scared to stay still. I got up and opened the door slowly, trying to be quiet. The hallway was dark, lit only by a few dim bulbs. I walked down it, my footsteps silent on the old carpet. As I passed the other rooms, I noticed some of the doors were slightly open, just a crack. Curiosity got the better of me. I peeked into one. Inside, the room was a mess, much worse than mine. There were tools on the floor, screwdrivers, pliers, and things I didn't recognize. A bag sat open on the bed, filled with unmarked bottles and plastic bags. I spotted what looked like blood on the carpet, dark and dried. My stomach turned, and I backed away, nearly tripping over my own feet. The whispers and footsteps were louder now, coming from all around me, like the walls themselves were whispering secrets. My heart was pounding so loud I could barely hear anything else. I kept moving, too scared to stop, too scared to go back to my room. That's when I heard the argument. Two voices, angry and low, coming from the room next to mine. I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel the tension, the danger in every syllable. Suddenly, it stopped. Dead silence. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Then, a door opened behind me. I turned around, and 3 men were standing there blocking my way. Their faces were hard, their eyes cold. The one in front spoke first, his voice like gravel. "What are you doing out here?" I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. I got lost, just looking for the vending machine. The lie was weak, and I knew it. They didn't believe me, not for a second. The man stepped closer, too close, and I could smell his breath, cigarettes and something rotten. "You should go back to your room, now." My body was shaking, but I nodded, slowly backing away, trying to seem calm. Yeah, sorry. "I'll just go back." I turned and walked away, feeling their eyes burning into my back, every step like walking on thin ice. I reached my room, closed the door, and leaned against it, my legs barely holding me up. I had to get out of there. There was no way I could stay. But how? The front exit was out of the question. They were there, waiting. I couldn't risk it. My mind raced thinking of another way. Then I remembered the back door. I'd seen it when I parked my car, a small door near the back of the motel leading to the parking lot. It was my only chance. I grabbed my keys and slowly opened the door, listening for any sound. The hallway was empty, but I knew it wouldn't be for long. I moved quickly, heart hammering in my chest, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. I reached the back door and pushed it open, the cold night air hitting me like a slap. I ran to my car, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking so bad I could barely get the door open. I threw myself in, started the engine, and sped out of the parking lot, not daring to look back. I didn't stop until I saw the lights of a small town. I found a police station and stumbled inside, barely able to speak, my words a jumbled mess. But when the officers arrived at the motel, it was empty. No men, no blood, nothing. Just an old, run-down motel that looked like it hadn't had a guest in years. They didn't believe me. How could they? I barely believed myself. Maybe I was just tired, seeing things that weren't there. But as I sat in my car, trying to calm down, my phone buzzed. A new message from an unknown number. I opened it, and my blood ran cold. You were lucky. Next time, we won't let you leave. I didn't stay to find out what they meant. I got back on the road and drove, not stopping until the sun came up. But I know they're out there, somewhere, and I'm never making that mistake again. It was late, and I was exhausted. I had been driving for hours and my eyes were heavy. The road was long and lonely, with nothing but darkness stretching in every direction. When I saw the sign for a motel up ahead, I didn't think twice. I just needed a place to sleep, somewhere to rest for a few hours before continuing my journey. The motel looked old and worn out, but at that point, I didn't care. I pulled into the parking lot, noticing only one other car there. The place seemed almost abandoned. I walked into the lobby, which was dimly lit by a single flickering bulb. The air was thick with the smell of old carpet and stale cigarettes. An ancient TV in the corner buzzed quietly, the picture distorted and barely visible. There was no one at the reception desk. I rang the bell and waited, tapping my fingers on the counter. After what felt like forever, a man emerged from the back room. He was tall, thin, and looked just as worn out as the motel itself. He didn't say much, just handed me a key and pointed down the hall. "Room 7, he said, his voice flat and uninterested. I took the key and turned to leave when I noticed someone sitting in one of the old armchairs in the corner of the lobby. He was dressed in a worn-out jacket and jeans, a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He looked up as I passed by, giving me a nod and a slight smile. "Long drive?" he asked, his voice friendly. "Yeah," I replied, not really in the mood for conversation, but too tired to be rude. "Just needed a place to crash for the night." "I get that," he said. "Mind if I join you? Could use some company myself." I hesitated for a moment, but then I shrugged. What harm could it do? I was just going to my room, and it might be nice to talk to someone for a bit before I went to sleep. The man stood up, and we walked down the hall together. When we got to my room, he leaned against the doorframe while I unlocked the door. The room was small and bare, with just a bed, a chair, and a tiny TV. It was far from luxurious, but it would do. "Mind if I come in for a bit?" the man asked. "I can share some stories from the road. I've seen a lot, you know." I was too tired to argue, so I nodded and let him in. He sat down in the chair while I collapsed onto the bed. He started talking, and at first, his stories were light and amusing. He talked about the strange people he'd met, the odd places he'd been, I listened, feeling myself relax a little. It was kind of nice, actually, having someone to talk to. But as the night went on, his stories began to change. They became darker, more unsettling. He talked about close calls with dangerous people, moments where he barely escaped with his life. His voice grew quieter, more intense, and I started to feel uneasy, but I was too intrigued to stop him. There was something in the way he spoke that kept me listening, even though I knew I should probably end the conversation. Then he began to tell a story that made my blood run cold. He described a traveler, much like me, who had stopped at a motel one night. The traveler was tired, just looking for a place to rest. But as the night went on, strange things began to happen. The traveler heard noises outside their room, footsteps in the hall. They started to feel like they were being watched, followed. The drifter's voice dropped to almost a whisper as he described how the traveler had tried to leave but found the door wouldn't open, how they had heard a knock on the window, seen a shadow moving outside, and then how they had realized too late that they were not alone. The traveler had been murdered in their room, the killer never caught. As he finished the story, I realized with a jolt that he was describing the very motel we were in. The details matched exactly. The old building, the flickering lights, the empty parking lot. My heart started to race as I looked around the room, suddenly feeling trapped. Was he trying to scare me, or was he confessing to something? I couldn't tell, but a cold dread settled over me. I decided it was time to end this. I stood up, trying to make some excuse to leave, but he didn't move. He just sat there, watching me with a strange smile on his face. When I reached for the door, he finally stood up, blocking my way. His friendly demeanor was gone, replaced by something darker, something that made my skin crawl. "You're not leaving yet, are you?" he asked, his voice low and menacing. Panic surged through me. I tried to stay calm, but my hands were shaking as I reached for the door handle again. He didn't move, just stood there, staring at me with that same unsettling smile. "Let me tell you one last story," he said, leaning in close. "It's about a man who thought he could leave, but he didn't get far. You see, the killer always knows where you're going." I froze, my mind racing. Was this some sick game? Was he planning to hurt me? I didn't want to find out. I needed to get out of there, but he was too close, too strong. I felt trapped, like a rabbit in a snare. He leaned even closer, his breath hot on my face, and whispered the last words of his story. "The killer always comes back for one last kill." And then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving me standing there, paralyzed with fear. I waited until I heard his footsteps fade away down the hall. Then I bolted the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the bed, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. Every creak, every rustle of the wind sent me into a panic. I didn't know if he was coming back, if he was still out there, watching. Morning came, and I left that motel as fast as I could. I didn't look back. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. Who would believe me anyway? But I'll never forget that night. The drifter's words still echo in my mind, haunting me. I can't shake the feeling that he was right. Maybe the killer does always come back. I didn't want to stop, but my eyes were heavy, and the road was becoming blurry. The sign for the motel blinked out of the darkness like a lifeline. I pulled in without thinking much, too tired to care about anything but sleep. The place looked old, with peeling paint and a flickering neon sign that buzzed loudly in the quiet night. Something about it made me feel uneasy, but I shrugged it off. I was just tired, I told myself. The lobby was empty, except for an old man behind the counter. He didn't look up when I entered, just slid a key across the desk after I handed him my credit card. I tried to make small talk, but he barely grunted in response. Whatever, I thought. I just needed a bed. I could be back on the road in the morning. The room was at the far end of a long, dimly lit corridor. The carpet felt sticky under my shoes, and the air smelled musty, like it hadn't been aired out in years. I pushed the door open, and it creaked loudly, almost as if it hadn't been opened in a while. The room was basic: a bed, a small table, a chair, but there was something strange about it, something that didn't feel right. I couldn't put my finger on it, so I just tossed my bag onto the bed and sat down. That's when I saw the note. It was crumpled, lying on the bedside table. I unfolded it slowly, half expecting it to be some kind of ad or reminder from the motel staff. Instead, there were just 3 words scrawled in shaky handwriting: check under the bed. I stared at the note, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. Was it a joke? Some kind of prank? I couldn't help but laugh a little, thinking about how ridiculous it was. But the more I thought about it, the less funny it seemed. Who leaves a note like that? My heart started to pound as I debated whether to actually do it. But curiosity won out. Slowly, I got down on my knees and lifted the edge of the bedspread. The space under the bed was dark, dusty. I reached for my phone and turned on the flashlight. That's when I saw the compartment. It was small, just big enough to hold a few items and covered with dust like it hadn't been touched in a long time. My hands shook as I reached out to open it. The lid creaked, and inside, I saw what looked like bloodstains. Dried, dark, and crusted along the edges. And there was another note. This one was more disturbing. The words were smeared, like whoever wrote them had been in a hurry or terrified. Leave now before it's too late. My breath caught in my throat. This couldn't be real, could it? My mind raced, trying to figure out if it was some kind of elaborate joke. But the blood, fake or not, looked too real, and the fear in the note seemed genuine. Suddenly, the room felt colder, and I had the overwhelming sense that I wasn't alone. I stood up quickly, looking around the room as if I might see someone lurking in the shadows. The old, creaky motel room that I had thought was just shabby now felt threatening. Every small noise, a creak, a rustle, felt like something coming closer. My heart pounded in my chest, and I realized that staying there wasn't an option. I had to get out, now. Grabbing my bag, I fumbled with the zipper, my hand shaking so badly that I almost dropped it. I could feel my pulse in my throat as I threw the door open and stumbled into the hallway. It was even darker than before, the lights flickering as if they were about to go out. The corridor seemed to stretch out endlessly in front of me, but I forced myself to move, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. By the time I reached the lobby, I was nearly running. But the lobby was empty. The old man who had been behind the counter was gone, and the silence was suffocating. I felt like I was in a nightmare, where everything was wrong, but I couldn't wake up. My mind raced with thoughts. What if the person who left the notes was watching me? What if they were still in the motel? I pushed through the front door and into the parking lot, the cool night air hitting me like a shock. My car was just a few steps away, but it felt like miles. My fingers fumbled with the keys, dropping them once, twice, before I finally managed to unlock the door. I jumped in, locking the doors immediately. As I started the engine, I glanced back at the motel room's window. My breath caught in my throat. There, standing in the window, was a shadowy figure. It was too dark to see their face, but they were watching me, and I could see something in their hand, something that glinted in the dim light. It looked like a knife. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The notes weren't a joke. They were real, and someone had been trying to warn me. I didn't wait to find out more. I slammed the car into gear and sped out of the parking lot, the tires screeching as I turned onto the main road. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst, but I didn't look back. I couldn't look back. The whole drive, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights following me, but the road behind me stayed dark. Still, I didn't slow down until I was miles away, far from that place. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that I was lucky to get out of there, that I was close to something terrible happening. I don't know who that person was or what they were planning, but I know one thing for sure. I'm never staying in a motel like that again. I've never been one to pick up hitchhikers. It's something I've always considered too risky, but that night was different. I was driving on a long, empty road. It was well past midnight, and I hadn't seen another car for miles. My eyes were tired, and my mind was numb from the monotonous drive. So when I saw a figure standing by the roadside, thumb out, I hesitated. But then, I felt bad. The guy looked harmless enough, just standing there in the dim light. Maybe he was stranded, desperate for a ride to the nearest town. I slowed down, pulling over a little way ahead of him. As he approached the car, I felt a small knot in my stomach. This was not something I normally did, but I told myself it would be fine. The man got in, barely saying a word. I asked where he was headed, and he just muttered something about needing to find a place to stay, a motel or something. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, his clothes wrinkled and dirty. He sat quietly, staring out the window as we continued down the road. For the first few minutes, we didn't talk much. The silence in the car grew heavy. I started to regret my decision. His silence was unsettling, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. His eyes, though focused on the road ahead, seemed distant, almost too calm. Occasionally, I caught him glancing at me, his expression unreadable. The atmosphere in the car grew tense, and my thoughts raced. Had I made a mistake? Was this man dangerous? Every small noise in the car, the hum of the engine, the rustle of his clothes, felt amplified in the quiet darkness. Eventually, I spotted a sign for a motel up ahead, a small rundown place on the outskirts of a town. The neon sign flickered weakly in the distance. Relieved, I turned off the main road and pulled into the parking lot. The place looked old, the kind of place where the rooms were barely cleaned and the sheets probably hadn't been changed in weeks. But it was a place to sleep, and I was too tired to be picky. I stopped the car, and the hitchhiker finally spoke, thanking me in a flat, emotionless tone. He got out of the car and walked toward the motel office. I watched him disappear inside, and a wave of relief washed over me. It was over. I'd drop him off, and now I could rest. But then I realized how tired I was. The thought of getting back on the road, driving for another hour or two, felt impossible. So I decided to check in myself, just for the night. It was cheap and close, and I didn't have the energy to keep going. After checking in, I made my way to my room. It was just as shabby as I'd expected. The bed creaked when I sat down, the wallpaper peeling at the edges. But it didn't matter. I just needed to sleep. I was about to turn off the lights when I saw something out of the corner of my eye. I turned my head toward the window and froze. There, standing outside, staring in, was the hitchhiker. Panic surged through me. He wasn't in his room, as I had thought. No, he was right outside mine, his face barely visible in the dark. My heart pounded as I stared at him, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Why was he there? What did he want? I quickly closed the blinds, my hands shaking. My mind raced, trying to rationalize the situation. Maybe he was just lost, confused about which room was his. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The look in his eyes wasn't one of confusion. It was something else, something darker. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself it was nothing, just a coincidence. But the feeling of being watched, of not being alone, wouldn't go away. I couldn't sleep, not with him out there. I lay in bed, every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside making me jump. Then I started to notice other things. The motel staff, who had been so friendly when I checked in, now seemed different, cold, distant. The way they looked at me, as if they knew something I didn't. And the hitchhiker. I kept seeing him out of the corner of my eye in the reflection of the bathroom mirror, standing in the hallway when I opened my door to leave. Always there, always watching. It wasn't just in my head. He was everywhere. And the staff, they were in on it too. I could feel it. They were working together, watching me, waiting for something. But what? I couldn't stay there any longer. I had to leave. The fear had become too much, too real. I packed up my things quickly, my hands trembling as I shoved everything into my bag. I just needed to get out, to drive away and never look back. But as I opened the door to leave, I saw him. The hitchhiker was standing there, blocking my way. His face was blank, his eyes cold. I tried to step around him, but he didn't move. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice low and threatening. I froze, my mind blank with fear. I didn't know what to do. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, the air around us thick with tension. I realized then that I had walked into a trap, that from the moment I picked him up, this had all been planned. I tried to step back, but the motel door behind me wouldn't budge. I was trapped, cornered between the hitchhiker and the locked door. There was no escape. The last thing I remember was his hand reaching for me, his grip cold and strong. After that, everything went black. When I woke up, I was back in my car, parked on the side of that same lonely road. The hitchhiker was gone, but the fear hadn't left me. It never will. Because I know, deep down, that this isn't over. Not yet. I arrived at the hotel late at night, my body aching from the long drive. All I wanted was a bed to collapse into, to close my eyes and let the exhaustion pull me under. The check-in was quick, the receptionist barely looking up as he handed me the key to room 306. There was something off about the place, a quietness that felt too deep, too still, but I shrugged it off as fatigue. I trudged up to the third floor, my mind already half asleep. The hallway was dimly lit, and the sound of my footsteps echoed in the silence. When I reached the room, I slid the key into the lock, turned it, and pushed the door open. The first thing I noticed was the suitcase on the floor. It was open, clothes spilling out as if someone had been rifling through it in a hurry. I froze in the doorway, my heart skipping a beat. My first thought was that the hotel had made a mistake, that they had given me a key to an occupied room. I was about to back out and head downstairs when I heard the bathroom door open. A man stepped out, towel around his waist, water dripping from his hair. His eyes widened when he saw me, but he didn't seem angry or surprised, just calm. "Oh, you're finally here," he said, as if he had been expecting me. He didn't seem bothered by the fact that I was a stranger standing in his room. "Sorry, I think there's been a mistake," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'll just go back to the front desk." "No need," he said, still calm, too calm. "You're in the right room. You belong here." I shook my head, backing away, but he stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "No, I don't think so. This is your room." That's when he said my name, my full name. It stopped me cold, my hand still on the doorknob. I stared at him, trying to place where I knew him from, why he looked so familiar. But my mind was blank, filled only with a rising sense of dread. "How do you know my name?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You've been here before." The word sent a chill down my spine. I had never been to this hotel, this town, in my life. But something in his voice, in the way he said it, made me doubt myself, made me question what I knew. I tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The lock wouldn't turn, the knob wouldn't move. Panic started to build in my chest as I pulled harder, but it was as if the door was sealed shut. "Let me out," I demanded, turning back to the man. But he just stood there, watching me with that same unnerving calm. My phone was in my pocket, but when I pulled it out, there was no signal. The screen showed no bars, no connection, as if I was cut off from the world outside. He took a step closer, his smile fading. "You can't leave yet. We need to finish what we started." I didn't understand. My thoughts were racing, trying to make sense of what was happening, why this man seemed so familiar, why I felt like I knew him but couldn't remember from where. And then it hit me. A memory, buried deep, of a news story I had seen years ago. A man who had been wrongfully accused of a crime in a hotel, who had disappeared without a trace. The case had never been solved. His face had been all over the news for weeks, and now, standing in front of me, I realized it was him. My blood ran cold. "It's you," I whispered, more to myself than to him. He nodded slowly, as if confirming what I already knew. I didn't deserve what happened to me. But now, we can make things right. I didn't understand what he meant, but I didn't care. All I knew was that I had to get out of that room. I lunged for the door, using all my strength to try and force it open. He grabbed my arm, pulling me back with a strength that didn't match his calm demeanor. "Stay," he said, his voice low and threatening now. "You can't leave until it's finished." But I wasn't going to stay and find out what he meant. I kicked out, catching him off guard, and he stumbled back. In that moment, the door finally gave way, and I threw it open, sprinting down the hallway without looking back. I didn't stop until I reached the front desk, my heart pounding in my chest. The receptionist looked up, surprised, as I gasped for breath. "Room 306, I managed to say. "There's someone in there. He tried to—" I couldn't finish the sentence, but the receptionist just stared at me, confused. "I'm sorry, sir, but we have no room 306. The words didn't make sense. I had just been there. I had the key in my hand. But when I looked down, the key was gone. There was no record of my check-in, no room assigned to me. I stumbled outside, the cool night air hitting me like a slap in the face. I didn't stop until I was in my car, driving as fast as I could away from that place, from whatever had just happened. But even as I left, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't really escaped, that somehow it wasn't over. I never liked staying in motels, but after driving for 12 hours straight, I didn't have much choice. I found this place off the highway, the only light in miles. It looked old, worn out, like it hadn't been cleaned properly in years. But it was cheap, and I was too tired to keep going. The owner, a greasy man with a crooked smile, greeted me too eagerly, as if he was happy to have someone stay at his rundown place. It felt off, but I ignored it. I just wanted to sleep. The room was what you'd expect, small, with outdated furniture and a smell that reminded me of mold. I didn't care. I dropped my bag, locked the door, and collapsed onto the bed. As I lay there, something about the room bothered me, like I was being watched. But that was crazy, right? I brushed it off as paranoia and soon fell asleep. The next morning, I was looking for my phone charger. I remembered dropping it by the bedside table, but when I reached down to grab it, I noticed the table was a little out of place, like it had been moved recently. I pushed it back, but as I did, Something shiny caught my eye. A small black dot on the wall hidden behind a painting. My heart skipped a beat. It was a camera, a tiny one, almost invisible if you weren't looking for it. At first, I thought it might be an old security device, something the motel forgot to remove. But the way it was positioned, pointed directly at the bed, made me uneasy. I checked the rest of the room and found nothing else, but that camera, it didn't belong there. I pulled out my phone and took a picture of it before covering it with a towel. My mind raced with what to do next. Was someone watching me? I decided to talk to the motel owner. He was outside, smoking a cigarette when I found him. I showed him the picture and asked what the camera was doing in my room. He looked at it, then at me, and laughed like I had told him a joke. "Oh, that? Don't worry about it. Just an old security measure, nothing more," he said, waving it off like it was no big deal. But it was a big deal. I insisted it wasn't right, that he needed to check it out. His smile faded and his eyes grew cold. "It's nothing to worry about. Just enjoy your stay," he said, turning away from me. That was when I knew something was seriously wrong. My gut told me to leave, but I didn't. Instead, I went back to my room, locking the door behind me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong, so I decided to check the room again. I moved the furniture, searched every corner, and that's when I found it. Scratches on the wall where the camera was, as if it had been installed recently. This wasn't just some old device. Someone had put it there, and it was recording. My heart pounded as I realized this wasn't just paranoia. Someone was watching me. But why? I remembered the owner's strange reaction, the way he brushed me off. I had to know what was going on, so I decided to check out the back office. I waited until I heard the owner's footsteps fade away, then quietly slipped out of my room. The office was easy to find, but it was locked. I tried a few keys from the ring I swiped earlier from the front desk, and one of them worked. Inside, the room was dark, filled with old papers and a dusty computer. But what caught my eye was the stack of VHS tapes and DVDs on the shelves, all labeled with dates and room numbers. My room number was there, and so were many others. I grabbed one of the tapes and put it into the player. The screen lit up, showing a woman, alone in her room, just like mine. She was sitting on the bed, completely unaware of the camera. My stomach churned as I realized what this was. They were recording guests, secretly filming them in their most private moments. And then I saw the letters, threatening letters, demanding money to keep the footage private. This wasn't just spying. This was blackmail. I felt sick, but I had to keep going. I dug through more tapes, more files, all showing the same thing. The motel owner was behind it, using the recordings to extort money from innocent people. And now I was his next victim. Suddenly, I heard the door creak. I spun around to see the owner standing there, his smile gone, replaced with a look of pure menace. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice cold. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out. I knew I couldn't trust him, and I knew he wouldn't let me leave easily. I backed away slowly, but he stepped forward, blocking the door. "Now, you know our little secret," he said, "and you know what happens to people who find out." Panic took over. I bolted for the door, shoving past him with all my strength. He grabbed my arm, but I broke free, running out of the office and down the hallway. I didn't look back. I just ran, my heart pounding in my chest, until I reached my car. I fumbled with the keys, finally getting the door open, and sped off without looking back. Even now, as I write this, I can't shake the feeling that someone is watching me. Every time I see a car behind me for too long, or hear a noise outside my window at night, I wonder if it's him, coming to finish what he started. I got away. But the tapes, they're still out there. And I can't help but think that someday, somehow, they'll surface. When they do, my life, as I know it, will be over. I had been on the road for hours, tired of the endless stretch of highway and the monotony of passing landscapes. When I finally spotted a small, dimly lit motel on the side of the road, it felt like a relief. The neon sign flickered weakly, vacancy in pale blue letters. The place looked run down, but I didn't care. All I wanted was a bed and some rest. Inside, the motel was even more depressing. The reception area was dimly lit, with old, worn-out furniture and a dusty counter. A bored-looking receptionist, a man in his late 50s, glanced up from behind the counter. His eyes were dull, and he barely looked at me as he handed over the key. "Room 17," he muttered, pointing down the hallway without any real interest. I took the key and made my way to the room, trying to shake off the slight unease creeping up my spine. The room was just as bad as I'd expected. Old wallpaper peeling from the walls, a stained carpet, and a bed that sagged in the middle. I dropped my bag on the floor and collapsed onto the bed, exhausted. The silence in the room was thick, almost oppressive. I could hear every creak of the building, every distant drip of water from a leaky pipe. I wanted to get some food, something to help me relax before I fell asleep. I picked up the phone by the bed and dialed room service. The menu was basic, so I ordered a simple meal, just a sandwich and a soda. I wasn't expecting much, but it would do. The food arrived quicker than I thought it would. There was a knock on the door, and when I opened it, a different staff member stood there. This one was younger, but like the receptionist, he didn't make eye contact. He handed me the tray and left without a word. I sat back down on the bed and started eating. The sandwich was bland, the bread stale, but I was too tired to care. As I ate, I noticed a strange metallic taste, but I told myself it was just my imagination. I finished the meal and washed it down with the soda. It wasn't long before I started feeling off. At first, it was just a slight dizziness, like I had stood up too quickly. But then, the room began to spin, and my head felt heavy, like I was underwater. Panic gripped me as I realized something was very wrong. I tried to stand up, but my legs felt weak. I reached for the phone, intending to call the front desk, but my vision blurred, and the phone slipped from my hand. Darkness swallowed me before I could even think of what to do next. When I woke up, everything was different. I wasn't in the motel room anymore. The first thing I noticed was the cold, hard surface under me. My hands were bound tightly to the arms of a wooden chair, and my feet were tied to its legs. My heart pounded as I struggled to move, but the ropes were too tight, cutting into my skin. I was in a small, dark room, barely enough space to move, even if I could. The only sound was the slow, steady drip of water somewhere behind me. Fear washed over me as I tried to piece together what had happened. The last thing I remembered was eating that damn sandwich. I tried to calm myself, thinking maybe this was a robbery. Maybe someone was after my money, my belongings. But something about the situation didn't add up. I hadn't seen a single person who looked threatening, just the disinterested staff at the motel. Hours passed, maybe even longer, I couldn't tell. My wrists and ankles ached from struggling against the ropes. My mind was racing, desperate to understand why I was here, who had done this to me. I kept thinking about that sandwich, the strange taste, how quickly I had lost consciousness. Someone had drugged me, that much was clear. But why? What did they want? I knew I couldn't stay tied up like this. If I didn't do something, I might never get out of here. I shifted my weight, trying to tip the chair over. It took all my strength, but finally, the chair fell sideways with a loud crash, sending pain shooting through my shoulder. But it worked. The ropes around my wrists loosened just enough. I struggled, pulling my hands free, and then untied my legs. Every muscle in my body screamed in pain as I stood up. My head was still spinning, but I forced myself to move, stumbling toward the door. It wasn't locked. That should have made me feel better, but it didn't. I pushed it open slowly, expecting to find the motel hallway, maybe a way to escape. But what I saw made my blood run cold. Instead of the hallway, I was staring at the inside of a small, damp basement. The walls were rough, made of old, crumbling brick. There were no windows, no light except for a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. The smell of mold and rot filled the air, making me gag. I looked around, trying to find an exit, but the only door was the one I had just come through. I stepped out of the room, my legs shaky, barely able to hold me up. I had no idea where I was or how to get out. The panic was setting in again, making it hard to think straight. As I moved further into the basement, I heard something. A soft creak, like a door opening somewhere nearby. I froze, my heart pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. I turned around, eyes wide, trying to find the source of the noise, but all I could see was the darkness closing in around me. I wasn't alone down here, I knew it. I could feel someone watching me, waiting. But who? And why? I didn't have time to figure it out. The door I had just come through slammed shut behind me, trapping me in the basement with whatever, or whoever, was lurking in the shadows. I was out of options, out of time, and I knew, deep down, that I wasn't getting out of this place alive. I was on the road for hours, my eyes heavy, my body aching from the long drive. The highway stretched endlessly, and when I saw the sign for a motel, I decided to stop. It wasn't the best looking place, old, a bit run down, but it was close to the road, and the price was cheap. I needed sleep more than anything else. The woman at the front desk barely looked at me when she handed me the key. Room 12, just down the hallway. The room itself was as old as the motel, with faded wallpaper, a musty smell, and a bed that looked like it had seen better days. But I was too tired to care. I tossed my bag on the floor, kicked off my shoes, and collapsed onto the bed. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, something felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but the room just didn't feel right. Maybe it was the old furniture or the way the dim light flickered above me. I brushed it off as exhaustion and closed my eyes. But I couldn't sleep. I got up, walked over to the small bathroom, and splashed water on my face. When I looked into the mirror, I noticed something strange. My reflection seemed delayed, like it wasn't moving exactly with me. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. Everything seemed normal now. I laughed at myself, thinking it was just the tiredness messing with my head. Back in the room, I tried to settle in again, but that weird feeling wouldn't go away. Every time I glanced at the mirror on the wall, something felt wrong. My reflection was there, but it didn't feel like it was really me. I started to feel uneasy, like someone was watching me. I stood in front of the mirror and moved my hand, slowly at first. The reflection followed, but there was a slight lag, just enough to make my skin crawl. I waved both arms, then turned my head side to side. The reflection mirrored me, but not perfectly. It was like watching a video with a bad connection. A cold sweat broke out on my skin. This wasn't normal. Something was wrong with that mirror. My heart pounded as I leaned closer, inspecting the surface. That's when I noticed it. The tiniest gap between the mirror and the wall. I could barely see it, but it was there. I pressed my fingers against the edge, and the mirror shifted slightly. My breath caught in my throat as I pushed harder, and the mirror creaked open like a door. Behind it was a small dark space, barely big enough to fit a person. My mind raced as I stared into the blackness. Why would a mirror hide something like this? I fumbled for my phone, using the flashlight to peer inside. What I saw made my blood run cold. There was a chair facing the back of the mirror, positioned just so someone could sit and watch the room. On the floor were old food wrappers, empty bottles, and a camera on a tripod. It was like someone had been living there, just behind the wall, watching whoever stayed in the room. Panic gripped me. I could barely think, but I knew I had to get out of there. I grabbed my bag, leaving behind anything that wasn't already packed, and bolted out of the room. The hallway was empty, the lights flickering overhead as I ran. I didn't stop until I was in my car, speeding away from that motel as fast as I could. My hands shook on the steering wheel, my heart racing even as the miles stretched between me and that place. I should have called the police, but all I could think about was getting as far away as possible. But even after I reached a different town and checked into another motel, this time one that seemed safe, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I saw my reflection, I froze, half expecting it to move on its own. The memory of that hidden room, of the chair and camera, wouldn't leave my mind. I kept telling myself that it was over, that I was safe, but the fear wouldn't go away. I avoided mirrors as much as I could, but they're everywhere. Every bathroom, every elevator, even the car's rearview mirror made my skin crawl. I knew it was just paranoia, but that didn't make it any easier to deal with. And then, tonight, as I stood in front of the mirror in this new motel, I saw it again. Not the delay, but something else. Movement in the reflection that wasn't mine. Just a flicker, a shadow passing behind me where nothing should be. I spun around, but the room was empty. I stared at the mirror, heart pounding, telling myself it was all in my head. But deep down, I knew I'd never feel safe again. Because now I can't shake the feeling that somewhere, someone is still watching me. And maybe, just maybe, they're closer than I think. I was exhausted. The long drive had drained all my energy, and I needed a place to rest for the night. I spotted a small, rundown motel on the side of the road. It didn't look like much, but I didn't care. I just wanted to sleep. The parking lot was almost empty, just a few cars scattered around. The neon sign flickered weakly, casting a dull glow over the place. When I walked into the lobby, I noticed how quiet it was. The air felt heavy, almost thick, like it hadn't been disturbed in a long time. A woman sat behind the counter, staring at something on the floor. She didn't look up when I approached, and when she finally did, her eyes were blank, as if she was somewhere else. She handed me a key without a word, not even a smile. I felt a chill, but I brushed it off. I was too tired to care. My room was at the end of a long, dimly lit hallway. The carpet was old and stained, and the walls had peeling wallpaper. It felt like time had forgotten this place. When I got to my room, I noticed the door next to mine had a heavy padlock on it. Strange, but again, I didn't think much of it. I just wanted to sleep. Once inside my room, I threw my bag on the bed and sat down, rubbing my eyes. The room was small and basic. A bed, a nightstand, a chair, and a TV. The air smelled musty, like it hadn't been aired out in years. I decided to take a quick shower before crashing, hoping it would help me relax. As I stepped out of the bathroom, I heard something. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I realized it was coming from the room next door, the one with the padlock. It was faint, almost like heavy breathing mixed with a soft scratching sound. I froze, listening. The sound was so quiet that I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. I tried to ignore it, climbing into bed and pulling the covers over me. But the sound wouldn't stop. The scratching became more persistent, like nails on a chalkboard. The breathing, too, grew louder, more labored, as if someone was struggling to catch their breath. My heart began to race. I told myself it was probably just an animal trapped in the walls, maybe a raccoon or something. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The sound was too human, too deliberate. I turned on the TV, hoping to drown out the noise, but it didn't help. The sound was there, right behind the wall, refusing to let me rest. I tossed and turned, unable to shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I kept glancing at the door that separated my room from the next, imagining what could be behind it. The locked door seemed to be calling me, daring me to find out what was making those noises. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I got out of bed and approached the door. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle, but of course it was locked. I noticed the padlock up close. It was old and rusty, but solid. It looked like it had been there for a long time. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was behind this door wasn't supposed to get out. My mind raced with possibilities. What if someone was trapped in there, needing help? What if it was something worse? My curiosity was battling with my fear, but in the end, curiosity won. I grabbed a paperclip from my bag and tried to pick the lock. I don't know why I thought I could do it. I'd never picked a lock in my life. But after what felt like an eternity, I heard a click. The lock fell open and I pushed the door slightly. It creaked loudly in the silence. The room behind the door was dark. It was much smaller than mine, more like a closet than a room. I reached inside and found a light switch, flipping it on. The light flickered a few times before staying on, revealing the horror in front of me. The room was a mess. A filthy mattress lay on the floor, covered in stains I didn't want to think about. There were chains attached to the wall, the kind used to restrain someone. Clothes and personal items were scattered around, some torn, some burned. The smell hit me next, a sickly, rotting odor that made me gag. My hands started shaking, and I felt a cold sweat forming on my back. Whoever had been in this room had suffered, that much was clear, and the thought that they might still be here, somewhere, terrified me. As I stood there, trying to process what I was seeing, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Footsteps. They were faint but unmistakable, coming from the hallway. Someone was coming, and they were getting closer. Panic set in. I slammed the door shut, fumbled with the padlock, trying to close it again, but my hands were shaking too much. The footsteps were right outside now. I could hear someone breathing heavily on the other side of the door. I managed to lock it just as the doorknob rattled. Whoever was out there was trying to get in. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do. There was no way out. I felt trapped, just like whoever had been in that room. The thought of ending up like them made me sick with fear. The doorknob stopped rattling, and for a moment, everything was quiet. I held my breath, waiting for something to happen. Then, without warning, the door banged loudly, as if someone had thrown their whole body against it. I jumped, stifling a scream. I had to get out. I grabbed my keys and ran for the door, yanking it open and sprinting down the hallway. I didn't stop until I reached my car, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. I drove away from that motel as fast as I could, not daring to look back. I never reported what I found. I was too scared, too shaken. But I can't stop thinking about it. About that room, about the person who had been kept there, and about what would have happened if I hadn't left when I did. Whoever, or whatever, was behind that door, they weren't done. And they're still out there. I travel a lot for work, so I'm used to staying in all kinds of places, some nice, some not so nice. But last week, I had an experience that I can't shake off. It still makes my skin crawl just thinking about it. I arrived at this rundown motel late at night. I was exhausted, and I just needed a place to sleep before continuing my journey in the morning. It was one of those old, small motels you see on the side of the road, with flickering neon signs and paint peeling off the walls. It wasn't the kind of place I'd usually stay, but it was the only option for miles. When I walked into the lobby, the clerk behind the desk looked surprised to see me. After a short, awkward pause, he told me there'd been a mistake with my reservation. Apparently, they had overbooked the rooms. At first, I thought he was going to tell me to leave and find somewhere else, but instead, he said they could accommodate me if I didn't mind sharing a room with another guest. I wasn't thrilled about the idea, but it was late and I was too tired to argue. I agreed, thinking I could handle a night with a stranger. After all, it was just one night. I got to the room first. It was small and smelled a bit like mildew. The bed was old and the sheets didn't look very clean, but I was too tired to care. I tossed my bag on the bed and sat down, trying to relax. I told myself it was just one night, and in the morning, I'd be on my way. A while later, the door creaked open, and my roommate walked in. He was a man, probably in his mid-40s, with messy hair and a wrinkled shirt. He didn't say much, just nodded at me and went straight to the other bed. There was something off about him, though. His movements were jerky, almost like he was nervous or on edge. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I felt uneasy. I tried to ignore it and turned on the TV, hoping to distract myself until I fell asleep. As I watched, I kept glancing at the man. He was pacing around the room, muttering under his breath. It was strange, but I told myself he was probably just tired or had a long day. But then, he started doing things that made me even more uncomfortable. He opened the drawers, looked inside, closed them, then opened them again, as if he was checking for something over and over. He moved the chair from one corner of the room to another, and then moved it back. He kept staring at me in this weird, unsettling way, like he was sizing me up or trying to figure something out. I tried to ignore him, but it was getting harder. My heart started to race, and I could feel sweat on the back of my neck. I kept thinking about how I was stuck in this room with him, how there was no one else around, and how no one would hear me if something happened. I wanted to leave, but I didn't know how to without making him more agitated. Then things got worse. He suddenly stopped pacing and stood in front of the door, blocking it. He turned to me with a look that I can only describe as pure paranoia. He accused me of spying on him, of trying to steal his thoughts. I didn't know what to say or do. I tried to stay calm, telling him I wasn't doing anything, that I was just there to sleep. But he didn't seem to believe me. His eyes darted around the room and he kept muttering about how I couldn't be trusted, how I was part of some conspiracy against him. I knew I had to get out of there, but he was blocking the only way out. I tried to reason with him, to make him see that I wasn't a threat, but nothing worked. He was getting more and more worked up, his voice rising, his movements becoming more erratic. I was terrified. My mind was racing, trying to come up with a way to escape. Then, in a split second, he turned away, distracted by something on the floor. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my bag, bolted for the door, and shoved past him as hard as I could. I didn't stop to see what he was doing. I just ran. I ran out of the room, down the hallway, and out into the night. I didn't stop running until I reached a gas station down the road. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone to call the police. When the police arrived, I took them back to the motel. But when we got to the room, it was empty. The bed was made, no sign of my things or the strange man. The police checked the entire motel, but they didn't find anything unusual. They even asked the clerk about the man I described, but he swore no one like that had checked in. The police seemed to think I was just tired, that maybe I imagined the whole thing. But I know what I saw, what I felt. I wasn't imagining it. I know that man was real. But now, I'm left wondering if he was ever really there, or if my mind was playing tricks on me. It's been days, but I still can't shake the feeling that he's out there somewhere, watching, waiting. I can't sleep, I can't eat, and every time I close my eyes, I see his face staring back at me. The cabin by the lake. I still remember the first time I saw that cabin. I found it on Craigslist while I was searching for a place to escape to. The listing called it a hidden gem by the lake, perfect for a quiet getaway. The photos showed a small rustic cabin surrounded by tall trees with a beautiful lake just beyond. It looked peaceful, like a place where I could finally get away from the stress of my life. Work was killing me. Every day felt like I was drowning, and I needed to get away before it completely swallowed me. That cabin seemed like the perfect place to do just that. The owner, Mr. Gray, answered my message right away. He seemed eager, too eager maybe, to rent the place out. When I asked why it was so cheap, he just said he'd like to keep it affordable for people who really needed it. That should have been a warning, but I was too desperate to care. I arrived late in the afternoon just as the sun was setting. The cabin looked exactly like the photos, maybe a bit older and more worn, but it still had that charm. The trees around it were tall and thick, and the lake sparkled in the distance. I parked the car, grabbed my bag, and went inside. The cabin was simple. A small kitchen, a living room with an old stone fireplace, and a bedroom with a bed that creaked when I sat on it. There were books on dusty shelves, books that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. There was a musty smell in the air, but I told myself it was part of the charm, part of the experience of staying in a place like this. That first night, I slept like a rock. I hadn't slept that deeply in months. But in the middle of the night, something woke me up. It was a soft creaking sound, like someone was walking on the wooden floor. My heart started racing, and I lay there, holding my breath, listening. But after a few minutes, the sound stopped. I told myself it was just the old cabin settling and forced myself back to sleep. The next day, I explored the area. The lake was even more beautiful in person. The water was clear and calm, reflecting the trees and sky. I spent the day fishing, reading, and just soaking in the quiet. It was the kind of peace I had been craving for so long. By evening, I felt more relaxed than I had in months. But that night, the noises came back. This time, they were louder, more distinct. It really sounded like someone was moving around in the cabin. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly got out of bed, trying not to make a sound. I checked the door. It was locked. The windows were all shut. I even looked outside, but there was no one there. I didn't sleep much after that. The third night was the worst. The noises started again, but this time there was something else. I could hear faint whispers. They were so quiet I couldn't understand what they were saying, but I knew they were coming from inside the walls. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a cold sweat on my skin. I stayed in bed, too scared to move, too scared to breathe. Then I heard it. My name. Someone whispered my name. I was frozen with fear. I didn't want to believe it. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe I was just tired. But it felt too real. I could feel the presence of someone, something in the cabin with me. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the police, but there was no signal. I tried to stay calm, tried to think. Maybe I was just stressed. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with this place, that I wasn't alone. I decided to leave. I packed my things as fast as I could, not caring that it was the middle of the night. I just wanted to get out. As I reached for the door, I heard it again. My name, louder this time. And then I felt it. A cold breath on the back of my neck. I bolted out of the cabin, not looking back. I jumped into my car and drove away as fast as I could, not stopping until I was miles away. When I finally felt safe enough to stop, I called Mr. Gray. I was shaking, furious, demanding to know what the hell was going on with that place. His voice was calm, almost amused. "You're not the first to leave in the middle of the night," he said. "Some people just can't handle the cabin's history." I hung up. I didn't want to know what he meant, didn't want to hear about the history. I just wanted to forget the whole thing. But I can't. Even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling that something followed me from that cabin. Sometimes at night, when everything is quiet, I hear faint creaking, like footsteps on the wooden floor, and every now and then, when I'm half asleep, I think I hear my name being whispered in the dark. This story creates an atmosphere of quiet dread, building tension as the protagonist's experience at the cabin goes from peaceful to terrifying. The simple, straightforward language keeps the reader engaged, making the story accessible while still delivering the horror.